He was an active-duty Navy SEAL on short leave, returning to a mountain cabin he hadn't seen since before winter set in. He expected silence. He expected rest. What he found instead was a shape standing motionless on his porch. A pregnant German shepherd, frozen upright in the snow, eyes open but fading. She hadn't wandered there by chance. Someone had left her facing the door, as if counting on the storm to finish what they started. By the time he felt the second heartbeat beneath her ribs, he understood this wasn't just a rescue. It was evidence. And whoever placed her there might come back to make sure she didn't survive. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? If this story moved you, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. Your single click truly means more than you know. God bless you for keeping hope alive. The storm had erased the road, the trees, even the sky above Iron Pass. Snow moved sideways in thick sheets, driven by wind that sounded less like air and more like something alive, pressing against metal and glass. The narrow mountain road had disappeared beneath fresh accumulation, leaving only faint tire impressions to follow. Daniel Brooks kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, posture upright, eyes scanning through the blur of white. At 37, he carried the controlled stillness of a man long accustomed to pressure. Lean and powerfully built, with a sharply defined jaw and a very short regulation beard shadowing his face, Daniel wore his dark brown hair cropped close, threaded with the first subtle strands of gray at the temples. His blue-gray eyes did not dart. They measured. They assessed. Active-duty Navy SEAL, currently on a short leave after an unforgiving training cycle, he did not relax easily. Even rest for him required discipline. The cabin appeared only when he was nearly upon it, a dark shape against the whiteout. It sat alone among tall pines, built by his father decades earlier, its timber walls weathered but solid. Daniel slowed the truck automatically, headlights sweeping across the porch. That was when he saw it. 3 steps from the door, near the edge of the railing, stood a shape that did not belong to architecture or drifted snow. He narrowed his eyes and leaned slightly forward. The beam sharpened the outline. A dog. Large. Upright. Unmoving. He did not feel panic. What he felt instead was recognition. Stillness like that did not mean calm. It meant exhaustion beyond resistance. He cut the engine and opened the door. The cold struck immediately, a clean and biting force that cut through his insulated jacket. His boots sank deep as he moved toward the porch. The dog did not react. As he closed the distance, detail emerged beneath the frost. A German shepherd female, full-grown but young, perhaps 3 years old. Her coat, once sable and dark along the spine, was now crusted in ice. Snow had gathered along her back and frozen in ridges. Her ears were stiff with frost, edges white and brittle. Her abdomen was swollen. Unmistakably pregnant, the curve pronounced even beneath the ice. Her eyes were open. Not wild, not pleading, simply fixed forward, as if waiting for something that had not come. Daniel stopped 1 step away and crouched slowly, lowering himself until he was level with her gaze. He had seen that look before, though never in an animal. Years earlier, during a winter operation overseas, weather had delayed extraction. Civilians had waited in exposed terrain longer than they should have. The memory had never left him. People upright in snow because sitting felt like surrender. That event had carved something into him, an intolerance for wasted minutes, for hesitation disguised as caution. He extended a gloved hand and touched the dog's shoulder. The fur resisted at first, rigid with ice, then yielded slightly beneath pressure. Warmth. Faint, but present. Relief came sharp and controlled. She was not gone. He noticed the details quickly, the way training demanded. No collar, no visible tag. Around her neck, beneath the ice, there were faint impressions in the fur, too even to be natural. His eyes moved lower. The underside of her abdomen showed light abrasions where hair had been rubbed down. Not severe, not graphic, but deliberate. She had not wandered here by accident. Her stance was wrong for that. She was positioned facing the door, aligned with the steps. Someone had placed her here. The thought did not ignite anger immediately. It produced something colder. Calculation. Whoever had left her likely believed the storm would finish the decision for them. He slid one arm carefully beneath her chest and another under her hindquarters. She did not resist. Her body was heavier than expected, weight increased by ice and pregnancy. As he lifted, her legs shifted slightly but did not fold fully. Muscles locked from exposure. He felt the tension in her abdomen, the subtle tightening that suggested strain beyond cold. Inside his chest, something tightened in response, not fear, responsibility. He turned toward the cabin door, boots digging into snow, breath steady and measured, each step deliberate. There would be no rushing this. No sudden heat, no panic. Panic caused mistakes, and mistakes in cold conditions multiplied quickly. Inside, the cabin air was frigid but sheltered from wind. He kicked the door closed and moved directly toward the stone hearth. The interior was simple and functional. Rough wood floors, a worn leather chair, a mounted rifle above the mantel, untouched but maintained. Daniel laid the dog gently on a folded wool blanket several feet from the fireplace, not close enough to shock her system. He removed his gloves and pressed 2 fingers against her ribcage. There it was again. A weak but steady heartbeat. Then, lower, he rested his palm against her swollen abdomen. He waited. For a moment, nothing. Then a subtle movement from within. Not imagined. Real. He exhaled slowly, eyes closing for half a second longer than necessary. Multiple lives. The realization shifted the scale of the situation. This was no longer a single rescue. He rose, methodical even now, and began building the fire with controlled efficiency. As flames caught and light warmed the stone, he glanced back at her. She remained upright, legs partially locked, as if even in safety she did not yet understand she could rest. He stepped beside her and spoke quietly, voice low and even. The same tone he used during operations when clarity mattered more than volume. "You're inside now," he said, not expecting comprehension, but offering presence. When he gently guided her to her side, she resisted for a brief second before yielding, muscles trembling as they unlocked. Her head lowered slowly onto the blanket. Snow melted into damp patches beneath her fur. Daniel watched her breathing, counted each rise and fall. Outside, the storm continued to move across Iron Pass, erasing tracks, softening evidence. Inside, a line had been drawn. If he had arrived minutes later, the porch would have held only snow and silence. Instead, there was breath. There was movement. And beneath the thawing ice, there was the unmistakable rhythm of life waiting for a chance. He did not yet know who had left her. He did not yet know why. But he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The storm had not chosen this porch. Someone had. And tonight, that choice would not stand. The fire cracked low against stone, while wind pressed hard against the cabin walls. Daniel kept the dog several feet from the hearth, close enough to feel warmth, but far enough to avoid shock. He moved with deliberate restraint, the same discipline drilled into him during cold-weather survival training years earlier in Alaska. Rapid heat could do more harm than good. He removed his outer jacket and laid it over her shoulders, then knelt beside her, one knee pressing into the wooden floor. Up close, the details became clearer. She was young, likely no more than 3, her sable coat thick and professionally maintained beneath the frost. Her build was strong and balanced, the kind bred for endurance and intelligence, not appearance. This was not a stray surviving off chance. As he rubbed warmth gently into her ribcage through the blanket, he monitored her breathing. Shallow, controlled, fighting. He respected that. Some part of her had chosen to keep standing until a door opened. As ice loosened and melted into the wool beneath her, Daniel noticed the marks more clearly. Around her neck were faint, evenly spaced impressions where fur had been flattened for long periods. Not a collar. Something tighter. Along the underside of her abdomen, near the curve of pregnancy, the hair was rubbed down in narrow lines. He did not jump to conclusions, but patterns mattered. His jaw tightened slightly. He had seen similar impressions before, not in animals, but in equipment restrained too long against movement. He reached for a dry cloth and gently wicked away meltwater from her ears. Her eyelids fluttered, but did not close fully. When he placed his palm lightly against her abdomen, he felt a subtle movement from within. His breath caught, steady, but deeper now. Multiple heartbeats meant time was narrower than he liked. He rose and added another log to the fire, judging the burn by sound and color. Then he moved toward the small radio unit mounted near the kitchen counter. Reception in storms was unreliable, but he tried anyway. Static answered first, then a thin signal. He adjusted the dial carefully until a voice came through faintly. It was the late evening check-in from Iron Pass County Dispatch. Daniel identified himself briefly, tone even, stating that he had found a pregnant German shepherd in critical cold exposure and might require veterinary consultation if conditions worsened. He did not dramatize. He never did. The dispatcher noted the call and said they would attempt to reach the on-call veterinarian in town. 20 miles south, in the modest clinic on Main Street, Dr. Laura Bennett had been finishing paperwork when the message reached her. Laura was 35, tall and slender, with auburn hair usually secured in a loose braid that rested over one shoulder. Her skin was lightly freckled from years spent outdoors on ranch calls, and her green eyes held the steady focus of someone accustomed to difficult outcomes. She had grown up on a cattle farm and lost her first dog during a harsh winter when help arrived too late. That memory had shaped her career more than any academic award. She was calm without being detached, compassionate without being naive. When dispatch relayed Daniel's description, she paused only a moment before gathering her emergency kit. A storm did not discourage her. It clarified her priorities. Back at the cabin, Daniel crouched again beside the dog. He tested her paw gently, flexing it a fraction to assess rigidity. There was resistance, but not permanent damage. Good. He adjusted her position slightly, supporting her abdomen with folded fabric to ease strain. As sensation returned, her muscles trembled in waves. He placed one steady hand along her shoulder, grounding her without force. "You're not outside anymore," he said quietly, voice low and even. He had used that tone in chaos before, when clarity had to cut through noise. Her eyes shifted slightly toward him this time. Not fear. Awareness. That mattered. He felt the weight of responsibility settle more fully. If labor began too soon, the odds would narrow fast. The radio crackled again, and Laura's voice came through clearer this time. She introduced herself briefly, her tone practical and unhurried. Daniel pictured her automatically. Steady hands, direct eyes, someone who valued facts over panic. She asked measured questions about respiration rate, gum color, abdominal tension. He answered precisely. She advised gradual warming, no direct heat, and minimal repositioning unless breathing changed. When he mentioned the marks around the neck and abdomen, she went quiet for half a second. "That doesn't sound accidental," she said finally, voice still calm but firmer. She explained that several working-line German Shepherds had recently been reported missing from a private breeding operation under quiet review for regulatory issues. Nothing confirmed, but the timing concerned her. Daniel absorbed that information without comment. His gaze drifted to the door as wind rattled it briefly. Someone had known this cabin was here. The access road was not visible from the main highway. That detail lodged in his mind. He returned his focus to the dog, whose breathing had grown slightly deeper now. Her abdomen tightened faintly beneath his palm. Not active labor yet, but stress. He checked the room temperature and adjusted the fire again, maintaining steady warmth. Control what you can. That had been his rule since his first deployment. He could not stop the storm outside, but he could manage the conditions inside these four walls. Laura's final instruction was simple. Monitor closely. Call if contractions increase. She would attempt to reach the county deputy in case this connected to the missing animal report. Daniel acknowledged and set the radio down. He sat back on his heels and studied the dog's face. Ice had melted from her lashes, revealing dark brown eyes that were no longer glassy. There was strength there. Quiet, but present. He exhaled slowly. Whoever had left her here had calculated exposure and distance. They had expected silence. Instead, there was firelight, breath, and a second chance taking hold one careful degree at a time. He placed his hand once more against her abdomen and felt it again. A small, determined movement beneath warming skin. Warmth was fighting back. And so was she. The wind had weakened, but the cold held its ground against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting a low amber glow across the wooden floor. Daniel knelt beside the German Shepherd, one hand resting lightly against her ribcage, counting the rhythm of her breathing. It had deepened since the night before, but something else had changed. Her abdomen tightened beneath his palm in a slow, involuntary contraction. He stilled immediately, eyes sharpening. This was not random muscle tremor from cold. This was internal pressure building. He slid his hand lower, careful and controlled, feeling again for movement beneath the warmed skin. There it was. Faint, then stronger. A second heartbeat, then another. His jaw flexed once. He had managed high-altitude insertions and maritime extractions without visible strain. Yet this quiet moment in a mountain cabin tightened something deeper inside him. Timing mattered, and the cold had already stolen too much time. The dog's body trembled as another mild contraction rippled across her abdomen. She did not cry out. She did not attempt to rise. Her endurance unsettled him in a way panic would not have. He leaned closer, examining her gums for color, checking capillary refill as he had been trained. Still pale, but improving. He reached for the radio without standing, keeping one hand on her shoulder to anchor her. "Laura?" he called, voice even, despite the tightening in his chest. Static answered first, then her calm tone cut through. He described the contractions precisely, resisting exaggeration. She listened without interrupting, asking for intervals, strength, duration. Her voice remained steady, but he recognized the subtle shift beneath it. Focus narrowing, concern sharpened. 20 miles away, Deputy Ethan Reed was already in his patrol vehicle when Laura's call reached the county line. Ethan was 28, tall and narrow-shouldered, with sandy brown hair kept regulation short, and a faint scar running along the edge of his jaw where a training accident years ago had left a permanent reminder. His face carried angles that made him look older than he was, though his eyes still held the restless intensity of someone determined to prove himself. 2 winters earlier, he had mishandled a livestock theft case when critical evidence was lost in a snowstorm. The oversight had not cost lives, but it had cost credibility. Since then, He approached every report involving weather and isolation with personal weight. When he heard about a pregnant German shepherd found exposed on a remote porch, something in him locked into place. Back in the cabin, Laura's instructions came clearly now. Do not encourage movement. Keep her temperature steady. Watch for increased frequency. Daniel nodded, though she could not see him. He placed folded blankets more securely beneath the dog's abdomen to relieve pressure without forcing position. Her coat, now partially dry, revealed the true depth of its sable pattern, dark along the spine and lighter at the flanks. She was strong beneath the exhaustion, well-bred, likely from a working line accustomed to discipline and command. That detail troubled him. Working dogs were not casually abandoned, they were investments. He did not voice that thought. Instead, he monitored the timing between contractions, counting seconds silently, his breathing matching hers. Another contraction came, stronger than the last. The dog's eyes opened wider this time, dark brown and alert despite fatigue. She looked directly at him, not in fear but in awareness. He recognized that look. It was the same expression he had seen in teammates during training evolutions pushed past comfort. Acceptance of strain, refusal to fold. He pressed his hand gently along her shoulder. "Stay with me," he murmured, tone low and grounded. He was not speaking only to her. He was speaking to the lives beneath his palm. He felt the subtle shifting again. Small movements pressing outward against warming skin. Not one heartbeat, multiple. The realization steadied him even as it tightened urgency. Laura asked about fetal movement. Daniel described what he felt in measured detail. She inhaled quietly before answering. It's possible the cold triggered early labor. Stress can do that. Her voice did not rise. It sharpened. She advised him to prepare clean cloths and maintain stable warmth, emphasizing that premature birth in low temperatures carried risk, but was survivable with careful management. Daniel rose briefly to gather supplies from the cabinet, movements efficient and controlled. He did not allow himself to imagine worst-case outcomes. Speculation had no tactical value. Observation did. Control what you can. He returned to her side, kneeling again, placing the cloths within reach. Deputy Ethan Reed's patrol truck climbed the lower grade of Iron Pass slowly, tires biting into packed snow. He informed dispatch he was responding to a possible animal cruelty case connected to a missing report from a private breeding facility under quiet review. His hands remained steady on the wheel, but his jaw was set hard. He did not yet know if criminal intent was involved. But the pattern unsettled him. A pregnant working line dog found positioned deliberately on a remote porch during a storm did not fit coincidence. He had learned the cost of ignoring subtle inconsistencies. This time, he would not let weather erase what someone might have intended to hide. Inside the cabin, the German shepherd's breathing grew heavier for several seconds, then steadied again. The contraction passed. Daniel checked her pulse once more, feeling strength returning incrementally. He glanced toward the door briefly, aware that the storm had concealed tracks through the night. Whoever had left her here had likely expected silence. Instead, there was firelight and coordination spreading outward through radio signals and patrol routes. He returned his focus to the warmth beneath his palm. Another small movement pressed outward, stronger this time. He exhaled slowly, the first genuine hint of cautious hope threading through his composure. The cold had nearly claimed them, but beneath thawing skin and steady hands, life was pushing back. Morning arrived without sunlight, only a thinning of darkness over Iron Pass. The storm had moved east during the night, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt deliberate. Daniel stepped onto the porch slowly, closing the cabin door behind him to preserve the warmth inside. The air was sharper now, cleaner, the kind that followed heavy snowfall. Fresh powder had settled over everything, smoothing edges and burying the violence of the wind. For a brief second, the world looked untouched. Then his eyes adjusted. He crouched near the edge of the porch, gloved fingers brushing lightly over the snow. Beneath the newest layer were compressed shapes, faint but unmistakable. Footprints. Not old enough to belong to the previous night's blizzard. These had been made after the worst had passed. They approached from the tree line, stopped 3 steps short of his door, then turned sharply away. He remained crouched longer than necessary, mapping the pattern in his mind. The stride length suggested an adult male. The depth indicated solid weight. No sign of hesitation until the turn. Whoever had come back had expected something different. An empty porch, perhaps a body already collapsed. Daniel's jaw tightened subtly. He did not rush inside. He followed the trail a short distance, careful not to disturb it, until it faded into the slope where wind had erased the edges. The visitor had not lingered. That detail mattered. It implied checking, not searching. Someone had returned to confirm an outcome. When he finally stood, the cold pressed through his jacket, but he barely felt it. The porch was no longer just a rescue site. It was evidence. Inside the cabin, the German shepherd lay on her side near the hearth, breathing steadier than the night before. Her coat had dried into its natural dark sable sheen, and the curve of her pregnancy was more defined now that ice no longer distorted her form. Daniel knelt beside her and rested a hand along her shoulder before reaching for the radio. He reported the footprints in concise detail. His tone did not rise. He did not speculate. He described direction, depth, estimated timing. Control the facts first. He glanced toward the door as he spoke. Whoever had walked that snow had not knocked. They had not called out. They had simply looked and left. 20 miles south, Laura Bennett stood near the front desk of her clinic, phone pressed to her ear. She had not slept much. Her auburn braid was loosely tied, wisps of hair falling around a face that showed both fatigue and resolve. When Daniel relayed the footprint details, her expression sharpened. She had already been reviewing documentation from Northridge K9 Holdings, a private breeding facility that operated in a gray area between high-end working dog sales and loosely monitored transport contracts. Their report of a lost pregnant female during storm transit had arrived too quickly and lacked specifics. Laura had learned over years of rural practice that incomplete stories often hid behind weather excuses. Snow made convenient silence. Deputy Ethan Reed arrived at Laura's clinic shortly after sunrise, boots leaving wet impressions across the tile floor. He had driven most of the night through drifting snow to reach the county line before daylight erased critical details. Up close, he looked even younger than his badge suggested, though the set of his shoulders carried a heavier weight. His sandy hair was flattened from hours beneath a patrol cap, and faint stubble shadowed a jaw still marked by the thin scar he rarely spoke about. He listened as Laura summarized Daniel's findings. He did not interrupt. He had made that mistake before, assuming he understood too soon. When she finished, he nodded once and said quietly, "If they came back, they weren't sure she was gone." Back at the cabin, Daniel photographed the footprints with his phone from multiple angles, crouching low to capture depth and spacing before the rising sun altered shadows. He had learned long ago that memory was unreliable under stress. Documentation was not. He considered the approach path from the tree line. It required knowledge of the terrain. The access road to his cabin was not visible from the main highway. You had to know it was there. That fact circled in his thoughts. The German shepherd shifted slightly inside, drawing his attention back. He returned indoors, closed the door firmly, and sat beside her. She lifted her head a fraction this time, eyes following him. Laura called again mid-morning. Her voice carried new information, Northridge K9. Holdings had provided a timeline for the loss of the pregnant female, claiming their transport vehicle had broken down during peak storm conditions. But weather data showed the heaviest snowfall hit after their stated time. The discrepancy was small, but significant. Ethan had already requested GPS logs from the vehicle in question. The facility's manager, a man named Victor Hale, was known in the region as disciplined and polished, late 40s, tall with prematurely silvered hair and a carefully trimmed beard. He presented himself as professional and civic-minded, often donating trained dogs to search and rescue demonstrations. Public image mattered to him. Laura had always sensed a distance behind his smile. Daniel listened to the update in silence. He did not know Victor Hale personally, but he recognized the type. Organized, controlled, comfortable with calculated risk. He glanced again at the dog's abdomen as a subtle movement shifted beneath his hand. Life continued inside her, despite the morning's revelations. The contrast grounded him. Outside, someone had expected finality. Inside, there was recovery. He understood that the next steps would unfold through official channels. He would not interfere with that process. But he would not underestimate whoever had returned in the snow. By early afternoon, the sun broke briefly through cloud cover, illuminating the porch in pale light. The footprints had begun to soften at the edges. Time was already working against clarity. Daniel stood at the threshold once more, arms folded loosely across his chest, studying the ground where the tracks had turned away. Whoever had come had not knocked, because they believed there would be nothing to answer. That assumption had been wrong. And that realization shifted the balance. The porch was no longer a silent place of waiting. It had become the first visible crack in a story someone hoped the storm would bury. Inside, the German Shepherd exhaled deeply and settled more fully against the blanket. Daniel closed the door behind him and latched it firmly. The footprints outside had confirmed what instinct had suggested from the start. She had not wandered into his life by accident. Someone had placed her there, and someone had come back to see if Winter had finished the job. The power failed just after dusk, and the cabin fell into firelight and shadow. Wind brushed the outer walls in long, low breaths, but the violent edge of the storm had passed. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. Daniel had already positioned extra blankets near the hearth when the first strong contraction hit. The German Shepherd's body tightened visibly this time, muscles pulling inward along her flanks. She did not cry out. Her breath shortened, then steadied, then shortened again. Daniel moved closer, one knee to the floor, one hand at her shoulder, the other hovering just beneath her abdomen. He had managed combat medical emergencies under far worse conditions, but this felt different. There was no enemy to counter, no external threat to neutralize, only time and fragile biology. He keyed the radio again, adjusting the antenna until Laura's voice cut through the static. Laura did not waste words. "Frequency?" she asked. "Under 5 minutes now," Daniel replied, eyes fixed on the subtle rippling beneath the dog's coat. Laura's tone shifted into full clinical focus. She instructed him to prepare clean cloths, to keep his hands warm before contact, to let the mother do as much as possible naturally. "Intervene only if necessary," she said. Daniel flexed his fingers near the fire before kneeling again. The dog's coat was fully dry now, revealing a powerful frame even in exhaustion. She was younger than her composure suggested, likely 3, built for endurance with broad paws and deep chest. When the next contraction came, stronger and longer, she turned her head toward Daniel, eyes dark and steady. He felt that look land squarely in his chest. Trust without language. The first puppy arrived minutes later in a small rush of fluid and effort. Daniel supported gently without pulling, following Laura's instructions exactly. The pup was tiny, slick, and fragile, its coat darker than the mother's, almost black along the spine. For a second, there was no sound. Daniel cleared the membranes carefully and rubbed the small body with a warmed cloth. The cabin felt impossibly quiet, except for the crackle of fire and his own breathing. Then the puppy inhaled sharply, a thin but determined sound. Daniel exhaled in response, without realizing he had been holding air. He positioned the newborn close to the mother's chest, where warmth gathered strongest. There was little time to celebrate. Another contraction followed quickly. The mother strained again, muscles trembling. Daniel monitored her breathing, counting under his breath the way he had during timed drills in training. The second puppy arrived with slightly stronger movement, lighter in color with faint tan markings along its tiny legs. It squirmed weakly but immediately sought warmth. Daniel's hands moved steadily, cleaning, drying, guiding without force. Sweat formed at the base of his neck despite the cold air. He ignored it. His focus narrowed to small details: temperature of cloth, steadiness of breath, color of gums. When the third puppy emerged, smaller than the others, Daniel felt a spike of concern. It was sluggish, chest barely moving. He rubbed gently but firmly, coaxing air into fragile lungs until at last the smallest cry answered him. Laura's voice continued through bursts of static, asking for updates. Daniel described each birth clearly, never dramatizing. The fourth contraction took longer to build. The mother's strength was fading now, her sides rising more heavily between efforts. Daniel shifted closer, supporting her head with one forearm while keeping his other hand ready. The final puppy came slowly, smaller than the rest, its body limp at first. Daniel's pulse climbed, though his movements did not. He cleared its airway and rubbed it carefully, speaking low and steady, though the words were less important than the rhythm. "Come on," he murmured. After several long seconds, the pup gave a faint tremor, then a fragile breath. Not strong, but present. For the next hour, Daniel worked without pause. He rotated warmed cloths near the fire, then replaced them beneath the pups. He removed his outer layer and draped it partly over the small cluster, using his own body heat to supplement the blankets. The cabin smelled now of smoke, damp fur, and iron from the wood stove. The mother, exhausted but alert, shifted slightly to draw her pups closer. Daniel watched the movement carefully, ensuring none were trapped beneath her weight. He had faced situations where adrenaline had driven him forward. This was different. It required patience and restraint. Strength measured in quiet minutes rather than force. Deputy Ethan Reed called briefly through the radio to confirm he was coordinating with County Animal Services in case additional medical support became necessary. His voice carried urgency, but also something steadier now, resolve grounded by action. Daniel acknowledged him with a short reply. The outside investigation continued, but inside the cabin, the only priority was survival through the night. He counted 4 small bodies pressed against their mother's warmth. 3 moved with growing strength. The fourth, the smallest, remained fragile, breath shallow but consistent. Daniel positioned it carefully against the mother's underside and covered them again. Near midnight, the contractions ceased completely. The mother's breathing slowed into deep, controlled pulls of air. The pups, still damp but warming, shifted instinctively closer together. Daniel leaned back against the wall, legs extended, exhaustion settling into his shoulders. Firelight flickered across the cabin ceiling. He studied the small formation on the blanket, mother and 4 newborns, alive because timing had shifted by minutes. This was no longer a single rescue. It was a family that had fought through cold and stress and calculated abandonment. He reached forward once more, checking each tiny chest for movement. All 4 rose and fell. The storm had not finished what it started. Night settled thick over Iron Pass, and the road below the ridge carried sound farther than it should have. Daniel heard the engine before he saw the lights. It moved slowly up the access road, tires crunching over packed snow with deliberate restraint. Not lost, not casual, intentional. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to a steady bed of coals. The German shepherd lay on her side near the hearth, 4 newborns tucked against her abdomen. Their bodies were small and uneven in color, 3 darker, 1 lighter with faint tan at the legs. The smallest pup's breathing was still shallow, but consistent. Daniel rose without hurry. He did not rush to the window. He listened first, counting the seconds between shifts in engine pitch. The vehicle stopped. The engine idled. Then it cut. He moved quietly to the rifle mounted above the mantel, not lifting it, only resting his hand along the stock. A boundary, visible if necessary. He positioned himself between the door and the blanket where the dogs lay. His posture was relaxed, shoulders down, feet planted. He had stood in doorways before, in cities and deserts far from this mountain, and he recognized the narrowing of focus that came when uncertainty condensed into choice. The knock came without politeness. 3 firm strikes against wood. Not frantic, not hesitant. Controlled. A voice followed. "We're here for our dog." Daniel did not open the door. "This property is occupied," he said evenly. "Law enforcement has been notified." There was a pause outside. Snow shifted under boots. When he stepped to the side window and angled his gaze carefully, he saw 2 men illuminated by moonlight reflecting off snow. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, mid-40s, thick dark beard threaded with gray. His jaw was heavy, and his nose had been broken at least once, slightly crooked to the left. He wore a heavy insulated jacket and stood with his weight forward, as if accustomed to pressing space with his presence. The second man was shorter, leaner, late 30s perhaps, clean-shaven with sharp cheekbones and restless hands that moved in small, impatient gestures. His eyes scanned constantly, measuring angles. The taller man stepped closer to the door. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, tone practiced. "A pregnant female from our facility went missing during the storm. We tracked her here." Daniel absorbed the statement without reacting. The word tracked lodged briefly in his mind. "You're too late for a misunderstanding," he replied. "Deputy Reed is already on his way." The shorter man shifted sideways, boots edging toward the porch rail. His gaze flicked to the window again, then toward the tree line. He was calculating exit paths. Daniel adjusted his stance slightly so he could see both the door and the side of the cabin in one glance. Inside, one of the puppies let out a thin, uncertain sound. The mother lifted her head weakly, ears angling toward the door. Daniel felt that shift behind him and did not turn. The taller man reached for the handle and tested it once. The door held firm. Daniel's hand tightened along the rifle stock, not raising it, but making its presence unmistakable through the window's reflection. "Step back from the door," he said, voice lower now, no anger in it. Just clarity. "You do not have permission to enter." Snow crunched again. The shorter man muttered something Daniel could not fully hear. He caught the tone, though. Irritation edged with disbelief. They had not expected resistance. They had expected confirmation. The tall man exhaled sharply through his nose, visible in the cold air. "We're trying to recover property," he insisted. "You're interfering." "Property doesn't breathe," Daniel answered. Silence stretched thin across the porch. Wind brushed the eaves. Inside, the smallest pup shifted again, pressing closer to its mother's warmth. Daniel remained still, every sense tuned to small changes. He did not anticipate violence. He anticipated poor decisions. That was often more dangerous. Then headlights cut through the trees from below the ridge. Blue and red reflections flickered against snow and cabin walls. The tall man turned first, jaw tightening. The shorter one swore under his breath and stepped back instinctively. Tires climbed the last incline quickly now. Deputy Ethan Reed's patrol truck came into full view, followed closely by a second vehicle marked with county insignia. Ethan stepped out before the truck fully stopped. He moved with controlled speed, posture upright despite the incline. Under the flashing lights, his features looked sharper, the scar along his jaw more visible. He kept one hand raised in clear command. "Step away from the door, hands visible." His voice carried authority without shouting. The second vehicle's door opened, and Sergeant Mark Delaney emerged. A stockier man in his early 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and a broad face weathered by years of rural patrol work. Delaney had a reputation in the county for steady judgment and little patience for excuses. He had once lost a case to technicality early in his career and had never forgotten the cost of incomplete documentation. The two men on the porch hesitated only briefly before complying. Hands rose. Snow shifted beneath boots as they were directed away from the door. Ethan's gaze flicked once to Daniel through the window. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Procedure unfolded in calm sequence. Questions were asked. Names were requested. Identification checked. The taller man identified himself as Victor Hale. Up close, under the patrol lights, his polished composure was thinner than it had appeared in community photos Laura had described. The shorter man avoided eye contact, jaw working as if rehearsing explanations. Inside the cabin, Daniel lowered his hand from the rifle and exhaled for the first time in several minutes. He did not step outside immediately. He waited until Ethan knocked once, measured this time, and announced the situation was contained. When Daniel opened the door, cold air rushed in briefly, carrying the smell of exhaust and melting snow. Ethan's eyes scanned past him automatically, noting the blanket near the hearth and the small shapes gathered there. His expression shifted, not softening, but grounding. "They alive?" he asked quietly. "All four," Daniel replied. Sergeant Delaney informed the two men they were being detained on suspicion of unlawful transport and abandonment of an animal under hazardous conditions pending further investigation. There was no struggle, just a visible tightening of control as handcuffs clicked into place. Snow reflected the patrol lights in pale flashes as the men were escorted down the porch steps. The shorter one glanced back once at the cabin, but whatever he expected to see was not there. When the vehicles finally pulled away, the mountain returned to quiet. Daniel closed the door firmly and secured the latch. He walked back to the hearth and knelt beside the German shepherd. She lowered her head again, breathing slow but steady. The pups shifted, small bodies pressing into one another. He rested his hand lightly against them, counting movement. All four responded. Outside, the road bore fresh tire marks now, cutting clean through snow that had once hidden everything. Inside, the line had been held. The knock in the dark had not ended in silence. Morning broke clear and cold, sunlight laying sharp lines across the snow. The storm was gone for good now. In its place came a brittle stillness that made every sound travel. Daniel stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching steam lift into pale air. Fresh tire tracks from the patrol vehicles cut across the lower ridge, evidence that the night had not been imagined. Inside, the cabin held a different rhythm. The German shepherd lay near the hearth, no longer rigid with cold, but heavy with exhaustion and recovery. The puppies, four small bodies clustered tightly together, shifted and rooted blindly for warmth. Their movements were stronger this morning, not frantic, steady. Daniel had counted their breaths before stepping outside, all four consistent. That fact alone steadied him more than the coffee. Deputy Ethan Reed arrived mid-morning, this time without lights or urgency. He parked cleanly along the access turn and approached with measured steps. Up close in daylight, he looked less tense than he had under flashing patrol beams. The scar along his jaw was more visible now, pale against wind-reddened skin. He removed his gloves before knocking, a small courtesy that told Daniel something about the man. Inside the cabin, Ethan's gaze moved first to the mother and pups. He did not crouch immediately. He assessed. Then he nodded once, as if confirming something internal. "GPS logs match your timeline," he said. "Vehicle stopped near the lower ridge before midnight. They circled back at dawn." Laura Bennett arrived shortly after noon in her aging blue pickup, emergency kit secured behind the seat. She stepped into the cabin carrying the clean scent of antiseptic and cold air. In daylight, her features were sharper. Green eyes alert, freckles faint against pale winter skin. She moved directly to the German shepherd and knelt, hands warm and practiced. She checked gum color, hydration, and abdominal tension with calm precision. The mother remained still but alert, watching every movement. When Laura gently lifted one of the pups, the smallest one, she examined its chest and respiration carefully. "They're stable," she said finally. "Premature, but stable. That's not luck. That's timing." By late afternoon, Sergeant Mark Delaney called with updates from the county office. Financial records from Northridge K9 Holdings had revealed irregular transfers tied to private buyers outside the state. Shipping logs showed incomplete entries on the night of the storm. The facility's official statement had shifted twice already. Victor Hale's composure had thinned under questioning, his polished confidence giving way to careful pauses and lawyered phrasing. Ethan relayed the information quietly while Daniel listened. The investigation was no longer a question of misunderstanding. It was documentation. The difference mattered. Weather had not caused this. Decision had. Laura finished her examination and looked up at Daniel. "She needs a name," she said, voice softer now. Daniel considered that for a moment. The dog lay with her chin resting lightly against the blanket, 4 newborns pressed against her ribs. She had stood through freezing wind and delivered life under firelight without panic. "Grace," he said at last. It felt simple and earned. Laura smiled faintly, approving without comment. One by one, Daniel studied the pups more closely in daylight. The darkest male had broad shoulders even at this age and a stubborn grip when nudged. "Ranger," Daniel murmured. The lighter one, quicker to shift and stretch, became Scout. The third, with faint reddish tones in the fur along its neck, he called Ember. The smallest, who had fought hardest for breath, he named Finn. Ethan returned 2 days later with official paperwork confirming temporary custody under protective hold, pending formal charges. His posture was different now, less defensive, more grounded. When he handed Daniel the documents, his fingers did not shake. He had pushed hard for the GPS evidence to be preserved before legal counsel could delay it. "It won't fall apart this time," he said quietly. Daniel recognized what he meant. Not the case alone, but the personal weight behind it. Redemption did not come with applause. It came with completed forms and steady testimony. Inside the cabin, Grace adjusted her position, drawing the pups closer as they nursed. Her coat had regained full sheen, muscles filling back out beneath warming skin. She no longer watched the door constantly. Instead, her gaze tracked the movement of her pups. Daniel noticed that change more than anything else. Survival had shifted into protection. He sat back against the wall and let the room settle around him. The low crackle of fire, the soft rhythm of breathing, the faint scratch of tiny claws against blanket fibers. There was nothing dramatic about it, just life continuing. By the end of the week, Northridge K9 Holdings was formally suspended pending criminal investigation. News traveled quietly through the county. Daniel did not seek it out. He stayed with the routine inside the cabin, feeding schedules, warmth checks, brief supervised time outside when the sun held steady. Ethan's report was filed without errors. Laura's medical notes were thorough and clear. No gaps, no missed steps. In daylight, truth had a way of holding shape. Grace slept deeply that evening. 4 small bodies pressed against her side. Daniel remained seated near the hearth longer than necessary, watching their steady breathing. The storm had tried to erase them. It had failed. Now the record would hold. Spring reached Iron Pass slowly, first in sound, then in light. The drip of melting snow from the cabin roof replaced the winter silence. Mud showed through along the edges of the access road. Pine branches sagged less heavily. Daniel stood on the porch one morning and let the warmer air settle against his face. The same boards that had once held a frozen, motionless figure now vibrated under the clumsy energy of 4 growing German Shepherd pups. Ranger had grown broad across the shoulders, already moving with a deliberate steadiness beyond his age. Scout was leaner, quicker to pivot at any sound in the tree line. Ember carried faint copper tones along his neck that caught sunlight when he ran. Finn, once the smallest and weakest, had filled out surprisingly well. He remained closest to Grace, but there was quiet strength in the way he held himself now. Grace watched them from the porch rail, posture calm but alert. Her coat had regained full luster, dark sable shining under spring light. The thin lines once visible around her neck had faded beneath healthy fur. She was still young, but there was a maturity in her gaze that had not been there before. Daniel had seen that look in soldiers who had survived difficult ground and come out sharper, not harder. He leaned against the cabin post, arms folded loosely, letting the sounds of paws on wood and soft puppy growls fill the space. Months earlier, the porch had been a place of waiting. Now it carried movement, noise, life. The court hearing had been brief and procedural. Daniel had attended in uniform, posture straight, expression steady. Victor Hale had avoided eye contact, his earlier polish dulled by documented evidence and testimony. Northridge. K9 Holdings license was formally revoked pending further criminal proceedings. Custody of Grace and her 4 pups was transferred permanently. Laura had stood quietly at the back of the courtroom, auburn hair pulled into a simple braid, green eyes watchful. When the judge signed the final order, she met Daniel's gaze and gave a small nod. Not celebratory, just certain. Ethan Reed had testified clearly, without hesitation, his earlier self-doubt replaced by measured confidence. He had learned to let documentation speak. Back at the cabin, Daniel spent several weekends repairing what Winter had tested. He replaced 2 porch boards weakened by moisture, reinforced the railing, sealed a draft along the north wall. The work was practical, not sentimental. But as he sanded and stained the new wood, he understood what he was building. Not just reinforcement, continuity. He carved the sign himself from a piece of pine cut from fallen timber behind the cabin. The letters were burned carefully into the surface with steady hands. Second watch. No life left behind. He mounted it beside the door at eye level, where anyone approaching would see it before knocking. Neighbors began stopping by more often once the road cleared fully. One of them was Mrs. Clara Whitaker, a widow in her early 70s who lived 2 ridges over. She was small but upright, white hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, pale blue eyes sharp despite age. She brought homemade bread wrapped in cloth and stood on the porch watching the pups wrestle. "You were meant to be home that night," she said simply. Clara had lost her husband decades earlier in a logging accident during a storm. She understood timing in ways she never dramatized. Daniel nodded, not because he believed in fate in the abstract, but because he believed in showing up when it mattered. When Daniel's leave ended, he packed his gear in the early morning before sunrise. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and dog fur, a grounding scent now familiar. Grace followed him from room to room, not anxious, just attentive. The pups tumbled over one another at the doorway, unaware of schedules and deployments. He crouched and ran a hand along each broadening back. Ranger held steady under the touch. Scout leaned in. Ember wagged with bright impatience. Finn pressed close and lingered. Daniel felt the familiar pull between duty and attachment. But it was different this time. He was not leaving them exposed. He was leaving them secure, them. Laura had arranged for a trusted rancher, Michael Torres, to check on the cabin twice weekly while Daniel was away. Michael was in his mid-40s, solidly built with sun-darkened skin and hands shaped by decades of ranch work. His beard was trimmed short, black streaked with gray. He spoke little, but kept his word. Years earlier, he had rehabilitated a neglected border collie that became the best cattle dog in the county. Daniel had watched him handle animals, firm, consistent, never harsh. That was enough. Grace accepted Michael's presence cautiously at first, then with measured approval. On the morning Daniel drove back toward the highway, the sun rose clean over the ridge. He paused at the end of the access road and looked back once. The porch stood empty in that moment, boards warm in early light. No figure waited in ice. No shape stood frozen in silence. Inside the cabin, life moved freely. He felt something settle inside his chest that had nothing to do with relief. It was steadier than that. He had not changed the world. He had changed the outcome of one night. Sometimes the most decisive stand a soldier makes is not on foreign soil, but at his own front door. Daniel shifted the truck into gear and drove on, knowing that on Iron Pass, under a sign carved by his own hands, no life would be left outside again. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder. They arrive in quiet moments when someone chooses not to walk away. Maybe God doesn't always change the storm. Maybe he places us on the porch at exactly the right time and asks what we will do. In our daily lives, we all stand before small decisions that shape someone else's survival. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe for more stories of courage, and may God bless and protect you and your family.